G'day. It's been a couple weeks since we've been together. I had a vacation. Bev and I got a chance to go with our oldest son, Sean, to Arizona. We went to Sedona, Grand Canyon, a couple other places. Anyone who does that during the month of June, July, or August should have their head examined because it's not made for human consumption during those months. The lowest it got was 103. One day it was up to 116. That's not made for people. Maybe lizards, cactus, but not people. But it's good to be back. And so we're continuing the series that we started a couple weeks ago, where we're going to be looking at the life of Elijah, and we're going to be looking at it through the lens of, in spite of these things, this is what we should be. This is how we should act. This is how our life should be conducted. And today we're going to be looking at in spite of the circumstances and see how Elijah again was victorious. So let's start with this. Elijah was obedient in spite of his time at the brook. So let's start with 1 Kings 17, 2 through 7. It says, "Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, 'Leave here, turn eastward and hide in the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan, and you will drink from the brook, and I have ordered the ravens to feed you there.' So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to Kerith ravine east of the Jordan, and he stayed there. Ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land." Okay, so let's again get the context. Elijah has gone before Ahab and Jezebel, given God's commandment that there was going to be no rain, and that was because of the evil kinds of activities that Ahab has been promoting, the ways in which he is undermining everything about what God wanted his nation to be like. So he sends Elijah, says there will be no rain until I'm sent back with another message from God that it will. So 2 years now have elapsed. Elijah has been sustained here by the ravens and the brook. And in this time, though, it's now beginning to dry up because it's been 2 years. The judgment of God has been on the land for that period of time, and obviously a drought has set in. I can just imagine that each day when Elijah goes to the brook to take a drink, he sees that every single day it's a little lower along the bank. It's a little slower as it flows past his hiding place. You got to wonder what he was thinking, you know? And what were his options at this point? Well, let's look at some. Option one would be this: to worry and then to just leave there because it's obvious that God has forgotten me. You know, as the brook gets smaller and smaller, perhaps Elijah's faith was drying up just like the brook was drying up. You know, you could be thinking, what good am I here? Just sitting next to this drying up riverbed. You know, if I leave here, maybe I could help someone. I can't help anyone out here. Plus, you know, there's a little concern, the fact that the water's almost gone now. Maybe God has forgotten me as well as the rain, forgotten that I'm even here. Maybe I ought to just move on, find something to do, someplace to go. Keep in mind these things first. God has not lost track of you. Not Elijah, not you. He has not misplaced any of us. God knows where each one of us are, folks. It's easy to think sometimes that, you know, this is God. Think of all the things he has to do in a day, right? I mean, he's responsible for maintaining everything. Every person, every life, every situation, every universe, every planet, every animal. I mean, it's a pretty all-consuming job, right? So maybe he's forgotten some of us, just misplaced us in the grand scheme of things. Maybe you're thinking as you're walking through cancer, he's forgotten all about you. Maybe you're caught up in a divorce that you just never wanted. And you're wondering, so where's God in all of that? Maybe you're on the verge of a financial collapse and you're just convinced at this point, obviously, he has abandoned you. How can I lean on him when this is happening right now? He has not forgotten you at the brook. He has not misplaced you in the unemployment line. You can take comfort in those words. There's another option. You could just simply complain, right? I mean, a lot of people do. A lot of people opt for just complaining. When things can go the way they want them to, when things are tougher than they want them to be, when things take longer than they want them to take, it's easy to fall into this motif, this lifestyle of just complaining. Elijah could say, hey, God, you know, I'm the guy you sent to proclaim that message to Ahab. Well, I was just kind of sitting here and wondering what's next. I mean, you do realize I'm running out of water, right? It's kind of lonely out here. And what's with those birds? Couldn't you have found a better way to get food to me than to have a bunch of birds just drop them off? Wouldn't those thoughts have maybe gone through your mind? Now, maybe not those exact words, but those thoughts. You know, we say things like, God, I know you led me to serve in this particular ministry, but, you know, I think I would rather do something else now. This seems too hard. Nobody really seems to appreciate anything I'm doing. I don't get hardly any recognition whatsoever. So maybe I need to be somewhere else. Maybe I need to do something else. If you want me to stick around here and keep doing what I'm doing, then things better change because they're just not going the way I wanted them to. We can easily fall into a lifestyle of complaining against God when things don't go just the way we anticipated. Is that not what Israel fell into, a trap while they were in the time of the wandering for 40 years? And in fact, isn't that part of the reason they wandered for 40 years? I mean, they were disobedient. They began immediately to wish they were back in Egypt. That's grumbling. They started to worship an idol, and that's really a sense of grumbling against the God that has done so much for you. They argued and fought with him over food and over water and over this and over that. And that's all they did. 40 years. And they don't even think about the things that God did for them. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But all they did was complain. All they did was grumble. Some Christians do that. Some Christians do that a lot. That's not a good option. There is another option. The third option would be to just simply wait on God. You know, the first two options see God through the circumstances of our life. So if things are good, then God is good. If things are bad, then God is bad. Elijah demonstrates something entirely different. He sees the circumstances of life through his God, through the eyes of his God. When Elijah sees the brook beginning to dry up, he doesn't begin to worry and leave, or he doesn't even complain. We hear nothing. We see nothing about that. Instead, he stays there until God tells him to do something different. The circumstances of his life did not change his opinion of God. He allowed his relationship with God to change his opinion of the circumstances in which he found himself. You know, a dry brook does not always mean that a failure or a defeat is just around the corner. It could very well mean that we have been absolutely faithful and God is about to reveal the next step in his plan. Like with Abraham and his call to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. That's his only son. Or when Paul is being stoned at Lystra just for preaching the gospel. When Joseph is being full of a life of integrity, never allows himself to be drawn into sin, is still placed in prison. Do not let your circumstances interpret your God. Let your God interpret your circumstances. That's essential. Second thing that Elijah was faithful in spite of was he was faithful and obedient in spite of an empty barrel. Now we got to move on in the story now. So now we're in verse 8 of 1 Kings 17. It says, "And then the word of the Lord came to him. Go at once to Zarephath of Sidon and stay there. I have commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food." So he went to Zarephath, and when he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" As she was going to get it, he called after her and said this, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I'm gathering these few sticks to take home to make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as I have said, but first make a small cake of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry, until the day the Lord gives rain on the land." So she went away and she did exactly as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. Why in the world does God send Elijah to a dying Phoenician widow who has nothing but an empty barrel? Why not to the home of some wealthy person who had laid up a bunch of reserves and had enough to be able to take care of their family and Elijah both? And why not to somebody in Israel? Well, why not to some fellow Jew? Well, we could be sure that if God had sent Elijah to any of those other places, what was going to happen through this part of the story would never have taken place. So at God's prompting, Elijah makes the 100-mile journey to the homeland. By the way, this is very rich as far as I'm concerned. To the homeland of Jezebel. Here is that prophet that has made a proclamation and has brought nothing but a dismal experience to the people of Israel because of the decisions of Ahab and Jezebel. And they're searching everywhere for him. Couldn't find him back in that small forest in the ravine. And now he's basically under her very nose. He's in her homeland. Now, when he comes there, his first request to this widow that he comes upon immediately as he enters this town is very significant. He asks for a cup of water. Why is that important? It's a drought. It's been a drought for 2 years. Water, I'm sure, was really precious at that time, no matter where you were. But the widow is willing to comply to that with no complaint. But when Elijah adds this, "Also, bake me a small little cake and bring that for me to eat," that was just too much. And so she begins to spill forth her story. And she tells Elijah that she had already given up all hope. What she was planning to do was eat the small little remnants that they had left, one last meal, and then they were just going to die. Now, I have to say at this story, it seems a little cruel. Elijah presses home the point of having her make him some bread first. That's very important that we go back and we recognize that when he told her, he said, okay, I understand your situation, but here's what I want you to do. You go back, make me something first, and then there'll be something for you and your son. What Elijah was asking for, by God's prompting now, this is not something, Elijah's just a really self-centered person. That's not it. Is what God had been asking Israel to do and had not received. It was for Israel to give their all. And he's asking this Phoenician woman, give your all to the God that I serve. Israel had been commanded to do that and yet refused. Now notice that what God asks for, he will provide the means for it to take place. Elijah says, don't be afraid, because the commands of the covenant are always coupled with the provision of his covenant. You and I have to keep that in mind. Every command of God is always surrounded by, supported by the provision of that same covenant, that same command. God calls to us and asks us, I've chosen a task for you. I want to use you, but first, you have to be willing to give me all that you have. You cannot hold back. You cannot be double-minded. You can't just serve me a little bit and think that that's going to be acceptable. And like the woman, this widow, in a very desperate time, we cry back just like she did. But God, you don't understand. You're asking too much. God, if I do what you tell me, it's going to cost me everything. My hopes, my dreams. Life is as I have planned it, things that I have envisioned, they're just going to have to disappear. Isn't there another way? And God lovingly answers each one of us, don't be afraid. I know what you need. But first, you must trust me in everything. Trust me with everything. So do you trust me? Now, this widow reacts in true faith. And when she does, look how God supplies her needs, Elijah's needs, each and every day. What was needed was to learn this, that there was a daily need for God's renewal, physically and spiritually. God could have provided a year's supply of food all at one setting. Couldn't he? Well, sure he could. He could have protected that from theft, from rot, from rodents, from anything. It could have been absolutely just locked down for no one but for them. He could have done that, of course. And wouldn't it have been easier? Wouldn't it have been even more impressive to see that huge pile of food every time you walked into your little, cabinet that you were trying to hold all this in, see it all banked up in this huge big pile? I mean, that would have been impressive, right? So why not do that? Keep in mind, God is not out to impress people. He's out to build people. And what he's building are people of faith and people of obedience. And that can only happen when we see how he provides our needs at just the right time, just the right amounts for our daily bread. There is a faith building in the food only coming one day at a time, because you had to wait on God to provide the next day and the next day. And it was as if every day was a reminder. Do you know why you exist? Do you know how you exist? You exist for me. and I maintain you. I supply your need. It was just like what he did for the Israelites in the wilderness. He sent manna. How did he send it? One day at a time. And the only day that you could pick up 2 days worth was when you were picking up for the day to come, which was the Sabbath day, where you're supposed to do nothing except focus on God. But if you picked up a double portion any other day, it would rot. It would have worms. It would smell to high heaven. It was horrible, and you couldn't eat it. Think of the miracle that it was that God did in providing for the 2 to 3 million people that traveled in the wilderness for those 40 years. According to the quartermaster general of the army, he said that God would have had to supply Israel with 1,500 tons of food every day. 1,500 tons of food. Now, to bring that much food each day, to do it in with human kinds of tools, it would take 2 freight trains, each a mile long, to bring in that much food. And that was needed every day for 40 years. Can you imagine? It's staggering, isn't it? Oh, and don't forget, they're in a wilderness area. Now, it doesn't mean it's totally arid, but there's not water everywhere. They'd have to have water. And if all the water you had was just enough to drink and enough to maybe clean a few dishes, here's how much water it would take for that many people. It would take 11 million gallons every day. That is a freight train with tank cars that is 1,800 miles long. Just to bring water, well, careful, listen, just to bring water for 1 day. And they were in the wilderness for 40 years. You know how much room it took for that group to just find a campsite? The campsite had to be 2/3 the size of the state of Rhode Island, 750 square miles. Just think about that. Think about trying to find that much space every time you were to move. God provided all that. God took care of all of those things for them. Now, do you think that it's a problem for God to take care of your daily needs? He provided for their daily needs so they would recognize their daily need of Him. He provides for us daily so we will daily remember that He is the one who provides. He is the one who sustains us. How many times have you taken food home from a restaurant in a doggy bag, only to throw it away 2 or 3, 4 days later because it just doesn't taste the same? Well, it's the same with our spiritual food from God. He wants to have something fresh every single day. Lamentations 3:22-23. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. You and I must come to grips with this reality, that God expects us to give Him our all, so He in turn can give us all that we need on a daily basis. So Elijah was faithful through the circumstances of the brook. He was faithful through the circumstances of the empty barrel, and Elijah was obedient even in spite of death. So let's move on in the story, verse 17. Sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse and finally stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and to kill my son?" "Give me your son," Elijah replied. And he took him from her arms and he carried him into the upper room where he was staying, and he laid him on his bed. And then he cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, have you brought tragedy also upon this widow I'm staying with? by causing her son to die. And then he stretched himself out upon the boy, and 3 times he cried out to the Lord, O Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him. And the Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. And Elijah picked up the child, and he carried him down from the room into the house, and he gave him to the mother and said, Look, your son's alive. And then the woman said to Elijah, Now I know that you are a man of God, and the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. Why did the son die? Well, the widow thinks she knows why the son died. She states it in verse 18. She said to Elijah, What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and to kill my son? See, her belief was based on a set of pagan ideas that Elijah had called attention to the gods about her sin, and then because of her sin, the boy died as a punishment. Now, this doesn't automatically mean that she wasn't a believer in Jehovah, because this is very similar to what the apostles were asking Jesus when he healed a man and they asked a question, who sinned, this man or his parents? See, this false teaching was very common during those times. In fact, I'll bet you may have entertained a thought like that a time or two. You might have thought God has sent some terrible plague against you because of some sin from your past. The death of the child, though, turned out to be just the opposite. Because of it, the woman was strengthened in her faith, and to the point that she gave glory to God. But mostly, I believe that Elijah was matured in his faith, and it set the stage for being even more equipped for the challenges that were going to come before him, which were going to even be greater than what he's already endured. Can you imagine the incredible faith that it must have taken on Elijah's part to even think that he could bring back someone to death, or from death to life? What you and I have to remember here now is very, very important. No one has been raised from the dead in the existence of mankind up to this point in time. It's never happened. I mean, what even possessed Elijah to think that it could be done? To think that he could even be a part of something like raising someone from the dead. That's inconceivable to me. The faith that God has been instilling in him from the brook to the barrel and now to the grave is incredible. We need to see that our victories in the past, those times of seeing God's great care and provision and the way he has sustained us and carried us through, is not simply for the moment in which we are observing his power, but it's for the future, when we will be called upon for something that is far more difficult to endure, for something that will take far more faith to be able to be victorious. A time that will demand us to remember then God's faithfulness in the past. It's imperative that we go through these times of faith building, because Satan does not relent. Instead, he will ramp up his attacks. If he sees us faithful once, he will want all the more to destroy us. His attacks will become greater. They'll become more often. They'll come from areas that we couldn't even have imagined. And if we don't learn from the times when God's taken care of us and sustained us and protected us in the past, we won't be prepared for the future. A mother wanted to have a surprise birthday party for her young son. So she made sure that everybody kept it a secret. She even planned it weeks in advance so that he'd have no idea what was happening. So about an hour before the party was supposed to begin, she yelled up to his room and told him to get cleaned up and then come on down after he was. Well, she called. He never responded. She looked all over. She couldn't find him. Finally, the guests start showing up because, they've all been told what time to show up. So they're there. And so everyone is here except the son. And the mom's just decided, hey, I guess we'll have a party. He won't be here, but we'll have a party. Later that day, the boy shows up. He looks around the house, and he sees the remains of what obviously was a really awesome party, and he asks his mom, what happened here? She said, well, it was a surprise party for you. So where you been all this time? He said, well, I thought that when you called me, you're going to go make me do some chores or go somewhere and do something I didn't want to do. So I went and hid in the woods. If you hear the call of God on your life, do not run from him. Do not attempt to hide from him. The only one that loses in those scenarios is us. God will always accomplish his will. He will always get done what he wants to get done. The only question is, will you be a part of that? Or will you come upon the remains of an incredible party and say, wow, what happened here? Instead, you and I need to learn from the time at the brook, the barrel, even at the grave, that God is good, God is great, God loves us. He will care for us always. I'll see you next week, and those of you who are in Madisonville, I mean that literally. I will see you next week. So you have a great week.